we shall start by looking into certain images. These are people carrying their luggages. Well, this is Ethiopia-Somalia border, and these are climate refugees induced by climate change drought in the Horn of Africa. Moving ahead, you can see the anger, despair, sadness on the faces of climate refugees in the northern Cameroon-Chad border. Moving ahead, this is the climate refugees of Indo-Bangladesh border by excessive flooding of the areas. So we'll be presenting climate refugees, a Sundarban case study, me along with Selma, Nico, and Matai. Moving ahead, talking just briefly about the overview of the situation. Climate change and environmental changes are the biggest factors of human migration, and this was first said by Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1990s. Recently, Professor Norman Mayers have said by 2050 there will be more than 200 million climate refugees in this world. Now, the biggest problem that the international arena focuses on is what shall we categorize? Do we say them climate migrants, climate displaced, or climate refugees? Talking about the term climate migrants, these are those people which relocate due to pull factors of better livelihood, and therefore climate migrants cannot be climate refugees, because climate refugees are always endured by the push factor of climate change. Moving ahead, talking about the climate displaced, the word displaced leaves the possibility of people coming back, and therefore this word is also not right in describing climate refugees. And the third word, climate refugees, these are those people who are forced to migrate, they are forced to cross borders or in between their country due to the catastrophic climate change impacts. But sadly, neither there is any international definition on climate refugees, nor the UNHCR basically endorse the term climate refugees. Moving ahead, talking about the global overview on climate refugees, according to the World Bank's Groundswell report in 2021, the most pessimistic scenario which can happen in 2050 is that there will be 216 million climate refugees in the world. Talking about the most climate-friendly scenario, there will be 44 million climate refugees in the world by 2050. And in the worst-case scenario, in the sub-Saharan Africa, what can happen is that in that particular region, there will be 86 million climate refugees by the year 2050, according to World Bank report. Now, talking about India's climate change vulnerability assessment, India is being ranked 7th in the Global Climate Risk Index 2021. And recently, a report called Mapping India's Climate Vulnerability was released, and in which there were 640 districts, and out of which 463 districts have been said to be climate vulnerable. And the magnitude is such that there are more than 80% people who are living in these districts. Talking about the Bangladesh case, if the sea level rises in the Bangladesh, there will be influx of climate refugees in India. And this takes us to the plight of Sundarbans that will be focusing on our case study.
What you see on your screen right now looks devastating. But the people of the Sundarbans in the Indian state of West Bengal have seen much, much worse.
I'm gonna introduce the Sundarban case study. The Sundarbans is a low-lying delta region rich in biodiversity which borders the Bay of Bengal and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It comprises 104 river islands, of which around 50 are inhabited. The Sundarban Reserve Forest, one of the large mangroves forests in the world, covering a total area of 40,000 square kilometers. In 2017, the area was thought to be home of 7.2 million people. In the past 2 decades, 6,000 families have become climate refugees and hundreds of thousands have been displaced due to a web of slow onset and sudden onset climate stress and socioeconomic vulnerability that led them to migrate from the region in search of work to adapt to their hostile living conditions. The region has seen significant rise in sea level in recent years. The inclusion of salt water has made agriculture unsustainable for some and also disrupted the fishing industry. The impact on local communities has been magnified by frequent tropic storms. It experiences sudden onset extreme weather events in the form of about 9 cyclones storms a decade, a third of which are severe. High population density has meant that climate change phenomena such as tidal surges can result in significant losses of life. Mangroves, who are in charge of keeping islands intact, are carbon absorbers, are severely hit by the storms. All these deny access to safe drinking water, lack of food security, and inadequate water sanitation and hygiene wash facilities. Salinity in the soil has reduced land productivity in a region primarily dependent on agriculture as its chief livelihood strategy. Salinity in water resource and lack of pipe water supply have resulted in poor health outcomes and high diarrhea-related mortality, especially among children. The socio-economic and climate axis in Sundarban is making life dire, and the result it is a nest for human rights violations. More than 40% of households in the Sundarbans live below the poverty line, and 13% are officially declared as the poorest of the poor. In most of the area, there is no electricity, no running water and sewage treatments, roads, or hospitals, which converge with the effects of climate change, making life in the area almost unbearable. This situation leads to the most ugly of human behavior and hits the most vulnerable in society, such as women and children. A vicious cycle is formed. Climate change leads to migration, leads to trafficking of children and women. Human trafficking in the Sundarban is striking. The number of girls recorded missing in the West Bengal have climbed up steadily in recent years, from 5,986 in 2016 to 6,640 in 2020, a phenomenon that is expected to get much worse and further exacerbate trafficking problem. Gender issues are also a big deal of the situation. Women in the Sundarban are not only the family caregivers, they are a big part of the household income, working as fishers due, due to the agricultural failure with the rising sea in the salty water, and re-establishing mangroves to protect the islands from flooding. The exposure to the saline water results in irregular menstrual cycles, urinary tract, vaginal infections, and miscarriages due to different stresses and lack of sustained available.
So, considering the climatic and socio-economic pressures faced by the people in Sundarban, the answer to the question, why are people migrating, might seem obvious, but reality is often never that clear cut. When it comes to taking the decision to abandon your livelihood, it is not a decision taken lightly. Hayden describes in The Sense of Place and the Politics of Space the close links between the sense of identity and culture tied to a land, and that leaving your home is almost like leaving a part of your own identity behind. This goes to illustrate that when we talk about migration, especially migration due to climate change, it is not so much a choice, but a necessity. As Matai described in the previous section, the issues that Sundarban face are multifaceted and complex. It is difficult to label a single root cause for the need to migrate out of the Sundarban region. This is where the discourse on threat multipliers plays a role in explaining the interrelation between the different conditions leading to migration movements. Buhaug describes in Vicious Circles, Violence, Vulnerability, and Climate Change, the fact that climate migration is a symptom of societal vulnerability as households find themselves unable to cope with environmental impacts and do not have the necessary support from the local, regional, or national communities. So the next question that we need to consider is, where are people migrating to? Many of the people that live in Sundarban are well below the poverty line, and as such don't have many options when it comes to moving. A common trend that is seen in Sundarban is that of island hopping. As one island gets submerged, the population hop over to the next nearest island that can support them. Part of the reason for this is because many of the poor individuals living in Sundarban are not recognized by either the Bangladeshi or Indian governments as climate refugees, and therefore encounter significant difficulties integrating to the mainland. The consequences of this kind of migration: precarity of life and the constant threat to security. As there are fewer and fewer islands in Sundarban, the population on the few islands left grows more and more concentrated and puts significant stress on the infrastructure available, whether it is access to clean water, electricity, food, shelter, and health services. To come back to Buhog, shocks to rural living conditions, food availability, and the lack of institutional support in dealing with the climate crisis are all climate-related drivers that present risks of conflict. In the case of Sundarban, there's a growing sense of desperation that, when paired with the many threat multipliers highlighted in this case study, could be used as an early warning system for potential conflict. As the Sundarban population experience growing hardships, people are turning to India for help and for solutions to the crisis before the situation worsens, both in the short term and the long term.
Although India has been engaged at the international level for many years in bringing climate change to the fore, it is relatively recently, since 2007 and 2008, that it has started to take action itself. In 2007, Prime Minister announced the Green India Programme. In June 2008, Prime Minister Singh released India's first National Action Plan on Climate Change, and India is a party to both the UN Framework Convention and the Kyoto Protocol. Under the plan, India has set a number of mitigation and adaptation policies focusing on innovation, efficiencies, and renewables. Analyzed through a political economy lens, India has chosen the path of green growth, striving to increase GDP while seeking to reduce its emissions and other externalities. Some examples of this are policies to permit off-grid systems, expand wind power, and subsidize solar projects. However, the strategy of decoupling GDP from material and energy use has been proven to be unworkable by Ward and Sutton's empirical model. For example, coal accounts for 39% of total primary energy demand in India and is projected to remain the primary energy source, with demand growing nearly threefold by 2030. More to the point is that regardless of the measures it takes, much of India's environmental and human security lies in the actions or inactions of the countries most responsible for emissions and other externalities. We would argue that the effects of the externalities have been locked in and are irreversible in some cases. The Sundarbans has illustrated the consequences of this over the past few decades. Thus, India's growth-oriented environmental policies, supported by Bretton Woods-oriented institutions, are insufficient in dealing with the risks it faces in terms of environmental disasters, leading to climate refugees and migrants, resource scarcity, thereby increasing poverty and vulnerability in the country which is home to the largest number of poor people in the world. However, it is unlikely that India will completely abandon GDP growth as a primary indicator of development. Therefore, we would suggest that the World Resources Institute recommendations calling for the decarbonization of India's economy should be taken seriously. To conserve and regenerate mangrove ecosystems, and then India must decarbonize its economy by shifting away from fossil fuel and compensating through carbon tax. This would result in more resilient coastlines on the Bay of Bengal, reduce emissions, and hopefully lead to massive savings in the future. Furthermore, India must use its status to push for reciprocity from the most polluting countries and demand financial reparations to ensure environmental justice for its victims of climate change. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation. We hope that we've brought new knowledge to all of you, and we hope we've brought up some points that can be ripe for discussion. Thank you.